So Emily put this panel together, and so first of all, I want to thank you, Emily, for doing so and for being such a um, stalwart uh, in the Wolf Society and for keeping it alive and active. Going into it now, Amrita Chakraborti is a full-time PhD scholar and senior research fellow at Jadavpur University. She wrote a master's dissertation on the woman shopper and the work of Virginia Woolf, but has also participated in projects related to literature and Bollywood movies within a feminist lens as well as religion. Chakraborti will discuss anti-work Woolf, Virginia Woolf, and critiques of waged labor. And then Amar Roy is a postgraduate student at Presidency University in Kolkata, currently pursuing a master's in English. His area of research interest primarily includes memory studies. He's presented papers at several forums, including University of Cambridge, looks like IIT Madras, Jadavpur University, Jamala Millah Islamia, Radambara Bharati University, and others. He's published papers with Ramakrishna Mission Residential College and Vishva Bharati University. And Tatyana Kasima, she's a PhD and junior research fellow in comparative literature at the University of Tartu. Her research interests are urban literature, heterotopic spaces, magical urbanism, depictions of cities in Virginia Woolf, Yompolari, and Clarice Lispector, and the Flaneur. And we'll start with Tatyana, Amrita, Amar, and then finally Meghna Dutta will close us out. Meghna has recently completed her master's in English literature from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, India. Research interests include feminist revisionist myth-making, the woman as the artist figure. She's co-authored and co-presented the paper Burning Flames and Dying Embers, The Possibilities of Womanhood, and Greta Gerwig's Little Women Own Your Story at the two-day National Student Seminar on Literature, Culture, and Film Adaptations organized by the Department of English, Cotton University.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Matthew. Let me see.
Glad to meet you too.
Do you see me on the screen or just my entire screen?
I can see both.
Okay, thank you. So this presentation is part of my larger research work, which centers around magical urbanism in the three short story collections by three different authors. I work with Virginia Woolf as one of them, but also with Clarice Lispector and Jhumpa Lahiri. So today I'll be presenting part of my research where I just focus on Virginia Woolf's short stories and windows as heterotopic threshold. I would like to start this paper with a painting, A Conversation by Vanessa Bell. In this painting, three women are talking in front of a curtained window, or rather, one woman is talking, leaning closer to the two similarly looking women who are nodding their heads as if in sympathy, leaning towards each other to show their support and solidarity. These three figures, linked by one story, become one entity, taking most of the space in the painting. This conversation is often described as conspirational. There is another dimension, however, that of the window, which at first glance might seem like a background, but in fact becomes a participant in the conversation. The curtains have the same brushstrokes as the listener's clothes, and the creases and pleats in the curtains are also similar to those we can see in women's clothes. As viewers, we become participants in this conversation, but we can also see the view from the window overlooking a colorful garden. The outside spills over into the room where the trees merge with women's hair and the flowers in the garden become a curtain. Gillian Beer, in her analysis of the painting, remarks that there are two windows here, the one that we gaze through as the picture frame, which silences the conversation for us, and the one immediately behind the woman, which draws in the garden. I would like to explore this aspect in my presentation today by focusing on windows as heterotopic thresholds that characters cross. Heterotopic spaces are focal points of transformations which act as mediators between real and illusory, where reversals of permanence and transience, public and private, often occur. In the case of a conversation, the painting and the window are two heterotopic thresholds which we as viewers cross twice. This can also be seen in Woolf's short stories, which allow the readers to enter both the interior world of characters as well as their houses. Together with Woolf's characters, we walk through the rooms, look out of the windows, wander the streets, stare at the walls, look into the mirrors, and wonder who is painted in the portraits. The crossing of multiple thresholds can also be experienced by looking at Bell's cover jackets of Woolf's novels, where interior space seems to speak out to the exterior. Here we also cross multiple thresholds, where the book cover frames our entrance into the book, and the window on the book cover creates another frame to be looked through. On the border of each threshold, there is a story which complements or contradicts the main narrative, and this makes this threshold heterotopic spaces in which thresholds affords the possibility of encounter for different and even conflicting identities. Therefore, the women in the painting, just like the flowers on the cover jacket, look both solid and blurry. They define the borders of spaces and at the same time merge into it. According to Gillian Beer, the women in the painting are solid objects. They, at the same time, dominate the space and become the space. This painting illustrates how domestic and public are reversed, and just like in Virginia Woolf's short story, Solid Objects, lost, broken, and forgotten objects that usually do not capture anyone's imagination become defining features of the environment. By picking up a lump of glass on the beach, John becomes curious about the origins of objects and their solidity and durability. While aiming for a career in politics, solid objects become his fixation to the point where the rest of the world appears blurrier and blurrier. Giving up his political ambitions, John devotes all his time to his solid objects, which, while being fragments of windows, vases, and furniture, become more complete than the world around him. In this short story, abstract concepts of politics are replaced by the solidity of the objects found on the beach, as they present real connections to the world, whereas the abstract political concepts and debates only take people away from it. Windows, as solid objects, have been given less attention in Woolf's short fiction. Images of glass and fabric are important to Woolf's short stories, in which textures, colors, sounds, and smells create a world in which characters wrestle with their conflicting experiences. I think I can stop sharing now. With their conflicting experiences. The conflict between the inside world of the room and the outside world of the city is heightened by the presence of a window which mediates this conflict. Through the distorted image in the window, they filter what is real and what is illusory, possible and impossible. Windows signify both solidity and transparency. Martha Nussbaum notes that Woolf's image of the window suggests that people are not completely sealed to one another. There is an opening one can see through or see in, even if one cannot enter. This opening can take the characters across time and space, while windows are placeless places. They give space for the characters to contemplate who they are. In view of this, Heterotopia becomes a tool to analyze the relationship of spaces within spaces, where each layer is not static or complete. The determining feature of Heterotopias is their otherness. Deriving from medicine, Heterotopia is characterized by misplacement or displacement and abnormality. According to Michel Foucault, heterotopic spaces are where all the other real sites can be found within the culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. According to Foucault, the features of heterotopia can be analyzed by placing them into 6 categories. The first principle states that heterotopias occur in every culture. According to the second principle, every society defines the way heterotopias function within their culture, and the functions of the same heterotopia can vary from culture to culture. In the third principle, Foucault gives an example of a theater, which is a space that brings a whole series of places that are foreign to one another. When analyzing windows as heterotopic thresholds in the short stories that will follow, I would like to specifically focus on this principle, as windows open possibilities of reversing the order, juxtaposing in a single real place spaces, several sites that are in themselves incompatible. This allows the characters to engage with the spaces in a way they might not expect, since, as Virginia Woolf writes in her diary, anything can be out of the window: a ship, a desert, London. The force principle demonstrates that heterotopias are linked to slices in time. These are spaces such as cemeteries, museums, and libraries where time never stops building up and topping its own summit. This principle is applicable to the city as a whole, which consists of spaces where time moves at different pace. The fifth principle characterizes heterotopias as a system of opening and closing that both isolates them and makes them penetrable. These heterotopic spaces are not freely accessible, such as barracks and prisons. If heterotopias seem to be openly accessible spaces, they generally hide curious exclusion. Foucault writes, everyone can enter in these heterotopic sites, but in fact, that is only an illusion. We think we enter where we are, but the very fact that we enter excluded. The last principle is the way heterotopias function in relation to all the spaces that remain. This last aspect also characterizes the nature of windows as heterotopic thresholds, as it deals with the way heterotopias create a space of illusion that exposes every real space, while at the same time heterotopias create a space that is other. This ability of heterotopias to alternate between two extremes reflects the nature of windows, which on the one hand are real spaces which open and close, admit light and air, while on the other hand frame and limit the space from within and without. Relying on the definition of heterotopia and specifically on these two principles I highlighted earlier, I employ the concept of magical urbanism. Magical urbanism questions the spaces in the city as permanent and static, demonstrating the urban spaces as porous, malleable, and transient. Heterotopic spaces enable the characters to look beyond the physical and possible and extend the definition of space into the realm of illusory and transient. In The Art of Watching, the literary motif of the window and its potential for metafiction in contemporary literature, Gianna Zocca points out, when we look out of a window, we might get the impression of an objective access to the world, whereas the view we get is actually still influenced by our subjective imaginations, interpretations, and projections, which we use to fill out the gaps in visibility. Windows are thresholds which help to connect the inside world with the outside. While having this function, as Hilary Dannenberg points out, merely being able to look out of a window to survey the world can bring a kind of magical lightning to the soul in facilitating the perception of another space outside and the access of light. While having a very solid physical presence as elements of architecture, windows also possess a magical quality. They frame reality, making it manageable, transforming and mediating the experience of characters, enabling and restricting the vision of those who look into and through them. Dannenberg highlights that the windows play a cognitively magical role in the human body's perception, negotiation, and connection of spaces. In Woolf's short stories, windows are tangible objects that can convey abstract concepts. I propose to look at heterotopic thresholds which alternate between danger and safety, blend static and dynamic features, and possess framing and liberating qualities. Windows are one of the examples of heterotopic thresholds that I will be focusing on. In Woolf's short story, Phyllis and Rosamund, the window appears at the very end of the story when Sylvia exclaims, "What's a black hole? I should burn, shoot, jump out of the window, at least do something." The window is a heterotopic threshold between the sheltered domestic life and the outside world of possibilities, which seem unattainable. The act of jumping out of the window is a radical way to plunge into the unknown world. The window, while sheltering the heroine, can also reverse its role and become a portal into a world of dangers a young woman is not prepared for. By presenting her with this possibility, Woolf illustrates that a window as a solid object becomes malleable in its function. The window frames Sylvia's opportunities, presenting her with a view of the world she can see only partly and imagine only using the limited knowledge and experience she has. A window becomes an artificial boundary she needs to cross while being a real physical object in space, framing her reality. Similar ideas are encountered in the story A Woman's College from Outside. The story begins with looking into the windows of a women's college, where Innumerable women are asleep. A woman's college from outside is full of delicious freedom and anticipation of student life. In this short story, Woolf merges the inside with the outside to heighten the pressure from the outside. Similarly to Phyllis and Rosamond, the window is a way to become seen, but also to show the outside world as a place women are not prepared for. A woman's college from outside ends on a heterotopic threshold where Angela, looking out of the window, feels the dangers and the opportunities of the world outside of the walls of the college. Oh, she cried, as if in pain, communicating the fear and the excitement, and also the feeling of being unprepared to face the world which is out of the window. The ending of the story shows Angela on the threshold, standing at the window in her nightgown, pain in her voice, throwing her arms out in her excitement, as she feels that some transformation is about to happen, but the fear comes from not knowing what this transformation might bring. Windows continue alternating between safety and danger in the short story A Society, which could be seen as a conversation that potentially could have started in the previous story, A Woman's College from Outside. As a group of women have gathered, trying to piece together what they know of the world, the city outside the window is full of sounds, shouts, and noises. War is being declared, peace signed, the omnibuses move up and down the streets, the windows of milliner's shop draw some women's attention, where the light still shone brightly upon scarlet feathers and golden slippers. Here, the women engage more directly with the city outside their windows. Looking through a window across the street and into another window, they cross multiple heterotopic thresholds. In this short story, windows break up the spaces into multiple spaces, which previously did not exist, creating multiple new spaces within a space, allowing the characters to create a world of their own in which they can function according to their own rules. The story A Society illustrates this well, as the women form a space of their own. At the same time, the windows are spaces of interruption. When Jane, one of the members of society, was ready to present the results of their research, the hum from the outside drowned her voice, thus reminding them of the city outside with its energy, pace, and challenges. These three stories could be read together, since in all of them, women find themselves on multiple heterotopic thresholds, in places in between where they have to forge a space for themselves. Therefore, what they have imagined the world to be like and what it really is does not match and end up being full of incompatible facts and events. Women in these stories are all having their conversations in front of windows, with the world always close by and yet out of reach. A Haunted House is another story which explores the static and dynamic nature of spaces, focusing on the thresholds between illusion and reality, past and present, imaginary and real. The house itself is a character illustrating Woolf's creative powers in bringing spaces to life. In a haunted house, the windows are constantly in focus as both static and dynamic objects, sealing all the windows when the house becomes unused and abandoned, and then coming to life again when wandering through the house, opening the windows, whispering not to wake us, the ghostly couple seek their joy. The boundaries between illusion and reality become increasingly blurred as the couple is moving in and out of the house, going upstairs and downstairs. As readers, we are moving through these spaces, not knowing for sure whether we are in a real or an imaginary space. This ambiguity combined with memories and imagination make the house a heterotopic space which spills over into the garden. The heterotopic nature of the house is further heightened by the reflections of apples and roses in the window as the shadow of a thrush crosses the carpet, contributing to the ghostly atmosphere. The emphasis on rooms is important here as they represent private spaces with windows acting as thresholds between private and public. The unsettling feeling the house creates is balanced by the repetition, safe, 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 throughout the story. The characters are not in full control as to what objects they might encounter, and in turn what memory or feeling it will ignite. The repetition of safe, safe, safe is something that the couple might be telling themselves to make their encounter with the spaces of the past safer. Endowing everyday spaces with magical powers is what this story in particular does very well, showcases the spaces as multi-layered and capacious, where multiple stories converge. These aspects become increasingly visible in Woolf's short story, The Journal of Mistress John Martin, in which Woolf creates multi-layered heterotopic thresholds. In this story, Woolf questions history writing and the selective nature of it. The journal of Mistress Joan Martin. In the story, windows are thresholds which transport the characters and the readers seamlessly from the 1906 to 1418. As Rosamond Merridew is walking through the house, asking questions and looking through the square windows opening on the garden, she mirrors the actions in the John Martin's diary of 1480. When walking through the house, Joan, Rosamond, and Mrs. Martin cross multiple heterotopic thresholds being brought together by stories from different times and spaces. Windows records the moment when the connection happens, allowing to read across the temporalities of Rosamond Merridew and John Martin, rather than to keep them separate. In this instance, the window becomes a dynamic object that transports the characters and the readers through time, with all the three women standing on the threshold, looking at the same view centuries apart. And the last category, which is framing and liberating nature of windows, has quite a lot in common with the previous ones, and I would like to focus here on two stories, The Duchess and the Jeweler and Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street. While The Duchess and the Jeweler is more overlooked and, according to Baldwin, is hardly among Virginia Woolf's enduring fictions than Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, I would like to put them side by side because in both stories, shop windows play an interesting role of heterotopic thresholds, which restrict and liberate the characters' identities. The Duchess and the Jeweler start with a description of Oliver Bacon's lavish apartment, where sofas filled the bay windows. In addition, Oliver can see the glossy roofs of fashionable cars parked in the narrow streets of Piccadilly. The view Oliver sees from his window is contrasted with his memories of his life as a young boy in a filthy little alley. This story is above all about Oliver's belonging in the part of city and his right to have this view from the window he has. In Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, we also follow Mrs. Dalloway as she looks into the shop windows, where she sees either a cloth or a painting or a book. What Mrs. Dalloway notices is a direct reflection of her class and upbringing, and her shopping habits inevitably become part of her identity. Both stories show how behavior in a shop dictates characters' identity, and shop windows, with their allure and promise of better life and an opportunity to substitute one identity, plays an important role. They act as heterotopic thresholds in imaginary worlds where one can be someone else. In both cases, we see that these promises are not fulfilled. While Clarissa is not able to buy the same quality French gloves as she used to before the war, Oliver looks at the pearls brought in by the Duchess, taking them to the window, realizing that they are rotten to the core. Both Oliver and Clarissa do not betray their disappointment openly, while Clarissa keeps sitting very upright, even though a violent explosion in the street made the shopgirl hide under the counter. Oliver sighs and takes the pearls, admitting that it is to be a long weekend. In both stories, the characters are able to hide their identity, thus reversing the reality and illusion in the world where pearls are fake and the violent explosion is a car backfire. By looking through the windows together with Woolf's characters, we test the limits of space, trying to identify where one space ends and the other one begins, and what happens on the thresholds between these spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Amrita Chakraborti. Are we ready?
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Emily and Jackson, for facilitating my participation, for the fees waiver you arranged. And a big thank you to all my fellow participants and everyone who took the time out to attend this session. Some of us might be familiar with various ideological movements which critique and or seek to reform or abolish work, which is namely the system of selling our labor power under capitalism. This philosophical tradition is called the critique of labor, the refusal of work, or the anti-work tradition. And of course, it is more than a philosophical tradition. It is a political movement. So you may well be familiar with the subreddit r/anti-work, which is an online community So the roots of the critique of labor school can be traced to Paul Lafargue's The Right to be Lazy, which was written around 1880 to 1883. And Woolf, of course, was born in 1882. And Lafargue points out that a central contradiction attendant upon capitalism is that technological progress does not in fact improve the lives of the majority of people in a society, who are driven to compete with the machine and with each other, and hence they are compelled to work harder under increasingly precarious conditions. So the machine, which multiplies human effort and should therefore have enabled humans to A, enjoy a better standard of living, and B, work less, does not accomplish either of the above. Instead, we face a situation in which the worker is threatened with redundancy, which in turn means that the worker will perish, because in an industrialized society, paid employment is the only means of subsistence. In such a society, industriousness is exalted as a working class virtue, so that the working class can produce more value for capitalists to accumulate, while conditions of oversupply in the labor market, as well as the markets for various commodities, cause real wages to decline. In a sense, if we think about the work of William Morris, for example, the zeitgeist of the 19th century is characterized by these impetus to imagine a world in which both work and leisure would be more pleasurable to people. Sometimes this happens through the imagination of a pre-industrial past, and sometimes it happens through the imagination of a post-industrial future. So Woolf's adult life also saw the proliferation of work which rejected the valorization of industriousness as a virtue. We can think of Bertrand Russell's In Praise of Idleness, for example, and 1 minute, right? And so actually, and at this point, if you look at these three texts together, you'll realize that the critique of labor school involves a lot of people. Like to this day, the political movement and the school of thought involves a lot of like Lafargue is very much a committed Marxist, and then you have Keynes also writing in the same tradition 50 years later. And if you look at the movement today also, you'll see that reform and revolution are very much equally represented. And actually, if you can think of the Bloomsbury group with its firm opposition to the warmongering industrial complex of the early 20th century, you would realize that this, of course, this school of thought resonates with the Bloomsbury group. We can think of Roger Fry's critique of the quote-unquote horrible toil of mass-produced artistic production, and in which he is talking about how mass production does not allow people to enjoy making the work. It does not allow people to enjoy consuming a work of art produced through mass production. So, and as Christopher Reed's scholarship has shown, the Bloomsbury group was committed to an amusing, quote-unquote, amusing artistic, emotional, and sexual values, as opposed to the Protestant work ethic. The importance of aspiring towards an amusing, ludic, or playful attitude to life and labor is, of course, an important aspect of critique of labor thought, as Bob Black, for instance, points out. There is, however, a fundamental problem in taking the Bloomsbury group as the champions of anti-capitalist values, given that the lives of many of their members, including Woolf's, were shored up by their position as members of the rentier class. Their economic position, living off the dividends yielded by capitalist enterprise, would place them in the class of people who directly benefit from a system in which the majority of a population are forced to provide increasing degrees of labor in order to survive at subsistence level. So if you look at J.M. Keynes's essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, written a year after A Room of One's Own, he talks about the importance of cultivating a creative ethic different from the Protestant work ethic, but he does not really question the modes in which surplus is created under capitalism. So in A Room of One's Own, there is a throwaway comment that that Mary Beaton received her fortune by after the death of her aunt, which was caused by a fall from a horse in Bombay. And so this would suggest that this fortune, which enables the gendered subject to take up a more creative life, has its roots in global networks through which labor and resources are extracted and imported into the purses of a rentier class. However, I would go on to argue that the fact that this income is not an earned income can be taken as a deeply subversive statement. So I would argue that Woolf mounts a two-pronged attack on the manner in which gendered labor is appropriated under patriarchal capitalism. On one hand, Woolf's oeuvre can be read as an expose of the ways in which unpaid and badly paid labor is extracted from women across class strata in order to bolster up the standards of living in their families. The labor of Mrs. Dalloway and Mrs. Ramsay is used in order to bolster their husbands' careers in politics and academia. The labor of the women servants in the Carlisle household and the labor of Jane Carlisle go hand in hand, even though class positions pit Jane Carlisle against the women working as maid servants in her family. And over here, and you can see that this is a quotation from the London Scene, in which the specific essay is, of course, Great Men's Houses, and Woolf is describing the Carlisle house on Cheyne Row, and there's this imagery. If you look at the essay, look at this quotation, and then there's this quotation. February after February, Mrs. Carlisle, and so you get a sense of embodied labor, which is present both in which leaves a mark both on the body of Jane Carlisle and on the body of the house. In Woolf's Memories of a Working Women's Guild, Woolf dwells upon how generations of sweated labor in the fields, in the factories, and in the households have shaped the bodies of working class women, which inflects their orientation to their surroundings. More problematically, of course, Woolf assumes that these subjectivities, especially the quote-unquote needs of working class women, are primarily shaped by the material conditions they labor under. And I didn't include quotations from this to illustrate this point in the slides I've prepared, because what Woolf says is in fact downright tasteless. In fact, when we study how Woolf acknowledges various forms of unpaid gendered labor, we also need to factor in the unpaid labor which women in her writing provide to the public sphere. We can think of Eleanor Paltiter in The Years, as well as Mary Datchet, who is working for the Vote without pay, and Mrs. Hilbery writing her father's biography, which is at once labor for a literary public sphere as well as a familial duty. As a part of this continuum, which she delineates between unpaid domestic labor and unpaid labor for a public sphere, in which women hope to stake a claim. For instance, Woolf discusses how women students at the women's colleges undertake rudimentary domestic labor, which their male counterparts would not have dreamt of providing. So this quotation is from Three Guineas, and she's talking about how the women's colleges were, how funds were gathered to build the women's college on the cheap. So what Woolf's oeuvre gives us a picture of is how this entire shadow economy through which women's labor is rooted keeps the machinery of high capitalism running, whether it is badly paid working class labor who are employed as maid servants in the houses of the capitalist and the rentier classes, or the labor of women in working class households, which allows then menfolk to function as the main industrial workforce. On the other hand, it is also crucial to note that Woolf also sees problems attendant upon the rapid influx of women into the white-collar workforce. And in this respect, she dissents from a liberal feminist discourse about opportunities. So if we look at Three Guineas, Woolf also talks about the fact that not only do women find it difficult to enter the professional sector, white-collar work is also set up in a way that systematically exploits women's labor. And Woolf was, of course, the first generation which witnessed the establishment of the office system as it exists today, in which women are allowed to provide white-collar services, but in a system in which they will be systematically exploited both as women and as workers. This is the context in which Woolf, in Three Guineas, talks about a point in history in which office girls are reported to be eating inadequately in the footnotes of Three Guineas, and in which women are organizing a bazaar to raise funds for women who hope to enter the paid workforce, and they are begging cap in hand for gifts of money, fruit, or cast of clothing. So if you look at this, Woolf is talking about how the paid labor available to women is also essentially discriminatory and exploitative. So I would argue that Woolf remains relevant to critique of labor or anti-work thought in the fact that she is able to delineate this nexus between several interrelated sectors of labor. And if Woolf is able to study this nexus between paid and unpaid domestic service, she also delineates the correlation between women students subsidizing both their unpaid academic labor and the offices and schoolrooms in which they will provide badly paid labor. It is at this juncture that it becomes fruitful to examine the relation between Woolf's £500 a year and her demand that women receive a basic income for their reproductive labor, which is articulated in Three Guineas. There is a small problem with this demand because Woolf tags this with demand, with the idea that this will raise the birth rate in the middle classes, which is to be desired. But also, what, as Selma James says, that this is actually a pioneering contribution to feminist thought, because Woolf is the first feminist thinker to argue for a wage to be paid for reproductive labor, as opposed to the family allowances which Eleanor Rathbone, her contemporary, was agitating for. If Woolf asks for a wage to be paid for housework and the work of raising a child. So what I would like to focus on is that Woolf is addressing Three Guineas to a man engaged in the white collar work of being a barrister, and she says that that if your wife is paid, then you will actually be able to you will be less dependent on your job. So she says that punishing regimes of paid employment will be countered if reproductive labor becomes paid labor. And according to Woolf, if the agent of reproductive labor is free from economic dependence on the wage earner of the family, then it becomes possible for wage earners to be able to refuse work and hence create a different economic order when, as it were, people, agents of reproductive labor and agents of productive labor are able to mount a united struggle. By pointing out that capitalism draws upon previously existing methods of exploiting labor in the patriarchal family by exploiting the precarity which is created when an entire family is rendered dependent on the remuneration paid only to those members of the family who are engaged in productive labor in the public sphere. Woolf is able to argue that there is a way of getting out of capitalist relations of selling labor if we recognize those forms of work which have hitherto not even counted as work, right? Moreover, Woolf, and this in turn allows Woolf to suggest the utopic possibility that in fact, if we are able to do this, then there will be a chance for us to dismantle the military-industrial complex because if as a culture we are less dependent on the kind of work the capitalists see fit to dole out to us as a privilege, we will be able to engage in creative and productive and meaningful work ourselves, right? So this is also from Three Guineas, right after Woolf. The previous slide and this slide come right after each other in the text. So in conclusion, I would say that it's possible to see Woolf then as a feminist thinker who imagines a radical reimagining of labor relations in order to envision a future in which lives will be less encased to creating a surplus for a capitalist class to reap the benefits of. £500 and a room of one's own need not then be imagined as assets that the capitalist market could yield to a few lucky women. Instead, a basic house income and housing are demands which have to be put forth through acts of political mobilization and resistance to the military-industrial complex, like the act of writing Three Guineas, in order to dismantle this nexus and then to reimagine how we can use our labor. This is a paper which is riven with contradictions, but the first problem in the methodology is that I start by trying to historicize Woolf, and then I end up trying to correlate Woolf to a contemporary movement. And also, the act of writing this paper is in a sense riven with contradictions because where does this paper come from? Really, it was written with a lot of love and a lot of conviction, but I have also produced it in an alienated regime in the alienated regime in which I sell my labor in a precarious academic job market. I put in extra hours, work late nights. I know I will not receive a direct payment for this. Instead, so in a sense, there are several important contradictions, several crucial contradictions at the heart of this paper, which, but I think it still makes sense. It's
Thank you. We can continue to unpack all of that as well as your candor about your situation after our next two speakers. Thank you, Amrita. We've got Amar and then Meghna will close us out. Amar?
I hope I'm clearly audible.
Yes, very clear.
So, a very good afternoon and good evening to one and all present here. I would like to thank the University of Louisville for giving me this opportunity. And let us quickly move to the paper. The title of my paper reads, Finding Mrs. Brown, Memory, Emotion, and Narratives in Virginia Woolf's approach to writing. Now, before proceeding any further, let us just fall back upon the basic backdrop against which Woolf was writing in the early 20th century. So the Great War had already brought in a sense of disillusionment that pervaded the entire society. And there was also Freud at the same time, who had brought in his tripartite structure of the mind. And usually while talking about the Cartesian notion of consciousness, the Cartesian homunculus, we mark a shift from that to the embodied consciousness, usually in or after the second half of the 20th century. But the tripartite structure had already set in an anticipation of the process. It was at this moment of crisis when Woolf wrote in Character and Fiction, I quote, "On or about December 1910, human character changed." What was this new kind of character that Woolf was trying to zero in on? A character that changed the course of literature, away from the objective realist narrative technique of the Edwardians to being characterized by Mrs. Brown. In Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, Woolf had written, I quote, "For what, after all, is character? The way that Mrs. Brown, for instance, reacts to her surroundings. In the first place, her solidity disappears. Her features crumble. The house in which she has lived so long topples to the ground. She changes the shape, shifts the accent of every scene in which she plays her part." Unquote. Let me briefly elaborate a bit on this before proceeding to our core entry point on how Woolf uses Mrs. Brown to explain her approach to art itself in an anachronistic manner. In Character and Fiction, the author writes, "But the things she, as in Mrs. Brown, does, says, her eyes, her nose, her speech, her silence have an overwhelming fascination, for she is, of course, the spirit we live by, that is life itself. However, as we've already seen, that life had become almost inscrutable, and there was a sense of disillusionment that pervaded the society in the early 20th century. And this is what Woolf comments on the shift of life in modern fiction and how it had affected our minds and our thinking process back at that point of time. I quote, "Examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms. And as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the accent falls differently from of old. Life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. Is it not the task of the novelist to convey this varying, this unknown and uncircumscribed spirit, wherever aberration or complexity it may display, with as little mixture of the alien and external as possible?" Unquote. What we have before us is therefore the iridescence of character that the author must attempt to sketch with as little fabrication as possible. This brings us to the most crucial part of our discussion. Modern fiction was written in 1919. That was the same year, as you may recall, when Eliot had also written his path-breaking essay titled Tradition and the Individual Talent. And one of the most contested sections of this essay was where Eliot had portrayed poetry as an escape from personality, as an escape from emotions, while simultaneously claiming, I quote, "But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things," unquote. Can you bear with me as I propose the possibility that Woolf's and Eliot's approaches to art in these two cases are not entirely polar opposites. Indeed, Woolf too asserts in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown that it is from the gleams and flashes of this flying spirit that one must create a solid living flesh and blood Mrs. Brown. Sadly, He must allow the lady still escapes him, unquote. How can the intimate and the detached be thus so conflated? This is the question that we have come to so far. Professor Arindam Chakraborti makes an ingenious observation of this paradox in Eliot's essay, thereby extending his study to the art artist or art audience interface in an article titled Play, Pleasure, Pain, Ownerless Emotions and Rasa Aesthetics. He questions that when the audience in a play or film, the reader of a narrative poem, or the viewer of a representational painting relishes a certain work of art, whose emotion is it that they relish or taste? He proceeds to propose that although there are several candidates for the intended owner or seat of art emotion, the specifically transmutated, suggested, distilled, or distanced emotion that is relished in aesthetic experience does not have any particular owner. He further clarifies that his assertion does not necessitate an absolute negation of the self. He puts forward the notion of a centerless, non-singular subjectivity, where individuality and situatedness are harmoniously juxtaposed. This view of art emotions steers us towards the entry point as per which emotions can no longer be relegated to a personal domain where there is no conscious realization of one's situatedness. In fact, Woolf herself states in the modern essay that the purpose of art is to evoke pleasure. I quote, to sting us wide awake and fix us in a trance which is not sleep, but rather an intensification of life, a basking with every faculty alert in the sun of pleasure, unquote. The anachronistic aspect of Woolf's words gets reverberated as we turn our heads to the study of Joseph Illidu and Richard Brown in A Higher Order Theory of Emotional Consciousness in 2017, as they connect Tulving's notion of autonoid consciousness to the working of emotions, that they are high order states instantiated in the cortical circuits of the brain, which are also the seats of rational thoughts, and thereby possess information of the self and the setting, giving an autobiographical turn to the episodic memories. This requires a little digression for a clearer understanding. The study of memory over the years has rendered remembering and unremembering as no longer ontological opposites, creating a paradox, but rather cognitively connected vectors existing interdependently. Andrew Hoskins, in Memory Ecologies, raises a fundamental question regarding the domain of memory in this context. I quote, where does remembering and forgetting begin and end? In the brain, the body, the group, or the media? Unquote. Deriving from John Urey's agenda of mobility in Sociology Beyond Societies, Hoskins marks a shift from the social as society to social as mobility, as the relatively fixed or fixable in time and/or space concept of cultural memory gets complicated by the trans-individual multidirectional memories. He terms this as connective memory. Memory as emergent, shaped as individuals and groups encounter or interact with objects, interfaces, and others in an ongoing fashion. More of a sort of a Garfinkelian interaction, where each and every individual is contributing significantly to the entirety of the interaction that is being formed. This conflation of the individual and the collective has also been reflected in Andy Clark and David Chalmers' work titled The Extended Mind, where the mind is projected as an entity inveterately linked with an active externalism in a two-way interaction, creating a coupled system that can be seen as a cognitive system in its own right. This finally brings us to the issue of emotional responses and the working of mind and memory behind the scene. In episodic and semantic memory, Tulving proposed the concept of autonoid consciousness as he distinguished episodic memory from semantic memory. The semantic memory was categorized as more of a situated memory based on a factual recording of things as provided by a knowledge that has been built on a collective basis with as the individual situates herself or himself within the society. The capacity to recursively introspect on one's own subjective experience through time, that is to perceive the continuity in one's identity from the past to the present and into the future, is marked by what Tulving calls autonoid consciousness. Episodic memory thus allows the remembering self to engage in a mental time travel and to consciously re-experience a past that is happening. These observations led Chakraborti to put forth the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis that says that a critical function of the episodic memory is to support the construction of an imagined future by allowing the retrieval of past experience and a flexible recombination of this experience with simulations of possible future scenarios. Thus, Ledoux and Brown's study of emotions as products of automatic consciousness in turn hints at how emotional responses, in a way, recreate the art itself. This finally brings us to the conclusion of the discussion. The capture of Mrs. Brown requires a harmonious integration of the intimate and the detached through a process of constant remembering and unremembering. And how should one read a book? Woolf writes, I quote, "To read a book well, one should read it as if one were writing it. He will be adventurous, broad in his choice, true to his own instincts, yet ready to consider those of other people," unquote. Again, in how it strikes a contemporary, she urges the writers to accept that their works will welcome new readings and new interpretations, therefore juxtaposing the author and the reader and integrating the domains of the individual and the collective. This diachronic approach to a particular text or art at large can also be traced back to Eliot and Freud, whom I have referred to previously. I recall the historical sense that Eliot talks about in his essay as a sense of the pastness of the past and the presentness of the past. And talk about Freud in Creative Writers and Daydreaming. He had talked about the date mark as an invigoration, as a source of the creative writer's mind, such that an unreachable past is made accessible in the present through an anticipation of futuristic possibility. As it stands, the capture of Mrs. Brown is to set her free, for she represents the kaleidoscopic aspects of life in the past, present, and future. That should be all. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Amar. And we've have Meghna Dutta is our final presenter.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really grateful to the University of Louisville and the annual panel of the International Virginia Woolf Society for giving me this opportunity. So with that, I would like to start. My paper is called Women with Diamond Minds, a study of the intergenerational evolution of creative women in Imperial England and colonial Bengal from the late 19th century to the first decades of the 20th century. It specially considers Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse and Ashapurna Devi's Subornolota and Bokulkotha for the analysis of the evolutionary process. To this end, it conducts a sociological survey of the complex intersections of ideological, economic, political, and racial forces that witnessed the distinct trajectory of the rise of the creative woman with artistic and literary aspirations in Britain and colonial Bengal. It then uses this broad intellectual framework of post-colonial feminism and traces its illustration in the process of individual creative evolution. In addition, it also locates the procedural changes wrought by authorial ideas on feminist resistance. First to be taken up is the condition of the British women and the rise of women artists from the later 19th to the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Following this, the rise of women writers in Bengal at the turn of the century will be explored relatively to the British condition. I would like to start the discussion with a triptych by George Elgar Hicks. It's called The Woman's Mission. There's a third part of this painting, which was called A Guide of Childhood, but that's lost apparently. So the triptych presents the sacred mission of a woman's life in Victorian period to perform the unpaid private labor of domestic roles, while men monopolized the public world of art, money, education, and politics. When the liberal political and economic ideas of the Industrial Revolution interacted with Enlightenment ideals and the rising proof of women's intellect in women-authored art and literature, the boundaries started being blurred. and an increasing number of women started trading what Anne Digby calls the borderland. However, the strategies of colonizing this liminal space varied due to the class-based difference in the idea of femininity. The hidden matriarchy of wage-earning working-class women was only an exception. The change was slow for the angel and middle and upper-class households. However, the bourgeois ideal of the economically dependent Victorian and Edwardian womanhood with its oppressive luxury soon gave way to increasing discontent at their state of wholesome rust. The result was the gradual rise of women's campaigns in the space of the social borderland. Led by the English middle class, these secured for the English women large-scale reforms in education and protection against child marriage, sexual double standards, and usurpation of private property. The upper-class English women opposed to political reform became increasingly involved in the public world of philanthropy, voluntary social work, parish councils, and self-governing bodies. Though such activities were meant to extend women's innately nurturant and compassionate qualities to the public sphere and create cultured wives, mothers, and teachers, they gave the next generation of women new role models. And by the beginning of the Edwardian era, the new generation of women, Edwardian era, the new women emerged to break out of conventional domestic and sexual roles and aspire to creative professions in the public sphere. And yet, pre-war England ridiculed such aspirations, with women artists suffering due to the expensive nature of art training, lack of public showing, charges of unsexing themselves, ostracization by the Royal Academy, and the anxiety of female authorship. It is only in the aftermath of the World War that they started gaining some power in forging public identities. Due to the part that women artists played in the depiction of women's role in the war during the course of the First World War. Moving on to the Bengali Hindu women, these women also suffered greatly under the sacred burden of conjugal, filial, and motherly duties, while the Bengali patriarchy controlled the public world of education, art, politics, and jobs. The presence of the white man's colonial rule meant even lesser accessibility of public roles. Moreover, the separation of the spheres was far more rigid in Bengal, and the idea of treading the social borderland only a distant dream. The working class Bengali women who tread the liminal space were exceptions like their English counterparts, as here too, the ideal of womanhood varied with class. Therefore, Bengali women in upper and middle class homes suffered doubly due to mental and physical confinement in the veiled existence, the parda, and the antapur, thrust into a traumatic world of child marriages, teen pregnancies, marital rapes, polygamy, day-round domestic toil, and the physical abuse of their husbands. Their oppression was manifold, and they were completely cut off from all the tools that enables their English counterparts to trade the social borderland and build up some resistance to patriarchal oppression. Barred from education, leisure, or a pre-existing tradition of women writers, the concept of participating in local government, social reforms, or political legislation was a far-fetched idea for people who were doubly colonized by gender and race. Hence, early reformers were mostly limited to the revivalists, the Christian missionaries, and the Bengali Bhadralok, who worked to introduce secular Christian and Orthodox education for girls and women. As one understands, unlike in English society, education opportunities were mostly restricted to the elite class in Bengal, and they were also male-dominated. Consequently, the progress was slow, and illiteracy was widespread even at the turn of the century for women in Bengal. However, the educated Hindu Bengali women refused to be limited by the roles of cultured wives and mothers. This, along with the arrival of the provincial printing press, the standardization of the Bengali language, and the ritual of informal literary salons, culminated in the rise of the first generation of the women authors in Bengal from the late 19th to the early 20th century. The object of patriarchal ridicule, they were careful to stay in the social borderland, warning against the neglect of domestic values, they apologized profusely for their weak intelligence and wrote within the patriarchal framework, while the middle class burnt their works in Disney. But the dissemination of their ideas finally percolated to the other classes of society. Arriving in India much later than in England, the second generation of women writers and national leaders were from the middle as well as the lower classes, and they were there was the rise of authors who were finally able to break out of the format of Antapur sketches and actually carve out full-blooded characters with strong public identities. But this happened really late, by the end of the 1920s and 30s, as compared to England, where women authors existed long before. And in fact, in England, there was a tradition of women authors, which was not really there in Bengal before the rise of the women author at the turn of the century. Following this, I would like to bring up the authorial perspective of both Virginia Woolf and Ashapurna Devi. So they were born within 14 years of each other. Woolf was born, obviously, in the late 19th century, and Devi was born in the first decade of the 20th century. So they inherited the values of these transitioning societies that I've been talking about. They also drew inspiration from this, and they captured in their works, in the creative mothers like Mrs. Ramsay or Suborno, the complex network of these socio-political influences, as well as their personal attitudes to women's activism. Woolf calls for the extension of Mrs. Ramsay's androgynous state of mind to society as a whole through the medium of arts, the balance of the feminine and the masculine, achieving the much longed for ideal of gender equality without rage or militant action. However, Devi's strategy of resistance to patriarchal oppression was obviously different. Her character Subornolota sings the songs of rage to break out of the oppression of middle-class patriarchy. The combination of these very different social and personal attitudes will influence the limits of oppression, resistance, liberation of both generations of women. And so I'll begin with how the socio-cultural attitudes to women, and as well as the personal perspectives of the author differently affects the creative evolution seen both into the Lighthouse and Subornolota and Bokulkotha. So to begin with, Mrs. Ramsay, she is basically the paragon of upper class Victorian womanhood with emphasis on nurturing roles, reading to James, assuaging Cam's fear of nightmares, alerting her children against ridiculing disagreeable male guests. Her duties as a mother are endless. To compound this exhaustion, her little rooms of private introspection are constantly intruded upon by the male need for validation and emotional support. Sacrificing her needs at the so-called sacred altar of the male ego, she's forever hosting parties, cooking meals, weaving stockings, and harmonizing the miserable silliness and chaos of little lives. Consequently, she's left with no time to be herself by herself. Time integral in creative and social pursuits. However, due to the slow collapse of that boundary between the public and the private sphere, Mrs. Ramsay too starts treading the social borderland like many upper class women of her time. And she weaves fantastical tales for Cam, hosts dinner parties, and yet dabbles in public philanthropic activities and dreams of becoming a social scientist. Here she is trading the borderland between the imaginary and the rational, the private and the public, and also the feminine and the masculine, when she brings together Lily Briscoe and Charles Stanley, the embodiment of feminine intuition and masculine aggressiveness. And this sets her up as the androgynous artist that Virginia Woolf had talked about in A Room of One's Own. And though she can never really establish a creative identity in the public sphere, it is her androgynous state of mind that ultimately enables her surrogate daughter Lily Briscoe to achieve her vision at the end of the novel in the last part, The Lighthouse. If we are to compare Mrs. Ramsay with Subornolota from Ashapurna Devi's Subornolota, we see that if Mrs. Ramsay succeeds in treading the social borderlands of the androgynous artist, Subornolota's socio-cultural milieu makes this an impossible dream. Late 19th century Bengal, with its sporadic education reforms, which were essentially led by men and elite women, the state of living in a middle-class household was almost a living death for the newly literate, creative Bengali woman. Suborno is plucked away from her childhood in Bethune school at the tender age of 9, and then she's introduced to domestic roles very forcefully. The trauma of marriage, marital rape, teen pregnancies she suffers is nothing in comparison to Mrs. Ramsay's relatively comfortable and leisurely lifestyle. If Mrs. Ramsay regrets the dearth of a room of her own due to demands of social etiquette and light domestic roles, Suborno's day starts and ends with hard domestic labor, responsibilities for a huge family, and even she receives the worst portions of the good meals for the family. Moreover, she is also physically confined to the ontopur, that is the inner sanctum of her home, and she can never really travel outside and explore the public world like Mrs. Ramsay does. In the absence of the material luxury and paid help available to a woman from the higher strata of the British society, her colonized sister suffers on account of both race and gender. Even the light ridicule of British men changes to harsh emotional and physical cruelty of the colonized Indian man. The greater burden of the Indian woman also spells greater rage, albeit within the private world. The rise of the literate and creative Indian women at the turn of the century enables Suborno to introduce new ideas of literature, education, national activism, and authorship in a middle-class household. And though she is forced to burn down her memoir due to the anxiety of female authorship, her radical ideas reach out and empower her daughter Bokul. With this, we come to the second generation of creative women, that is Lily Briscoe and Bokul. The daughters of this first generation of creative women succeed in achieving a room of their own. But what varies is the degree and point of culmination of the process of intergenerational evolution. The embodiment of the Victorian new woman, Lily chooses a life of art despite echoes of women can't paint, women can't write, and the constant pressure for marriage. But the public and private ostracization of women artists leave her in the haunting trail of the masculine tradition. And Lily fails to finish her painting in the window, and does so only when women have assumed more public roles after their somewhat equal effort in the First World War. Woolf articulates this change in terms of Lily's psychic journey towards Mrs. Ramsay, the symbol of the balanced existence of the masculine and feminine in the androgynous mind. Once Lily learns the strategy of resisting men without wrathful existence, as she does in the face of Mr. Ramsay's emotional demands, she is able to achieve the balance that completes her vision. This, Woolf believed, would serve to extend the idea of androgyny and enable Lily to establish her creative identity in the public sphere. Bokulbala Chatterjee, the embodiment of the second generation Bengali women, is only a child when the when her English counterpart Lily Briscoe achieves her vision. It is only several years later, in the 30s and the 40s, that she will establish her identity as the author Anamika Devi. A voracious reader with an interest in poetry and prose, Bokul is able to access schooling, tuitions, and a relatively normal childhood with the expanding of women's education beyond the elite circle in the second decade of the 20th century. Even then, the death of her mother Suborno puts a sudden stop to her academic pursuits. But this is Bengal's new woman, so as Suborno's daughter braves the barrage of familial criticisms, she refuses to get married and carries on with her literary pursuits. From this persistent determination emerges a strong and mature woman with limitless courage. As her fame and wealth rises, Bokul gives herself the gift of a new name, Anamika Devi. She calls herself, armed with the newly reconstructed identity, financial independence, and a room of her own. Bokul is finally able to write and sell brilliant fiction with real women characters unconstrained in their little sketches. To conclude, the intergenerational process of the evolution of creative women in Woolf and Devi gives us an insight into how complex forces of society, the perspective of the author, and the medium of creativity influence and change the rise of the artist figure. And this can be used to critique Woolf's own theoretical perspective, wherein she witnesses resistance without rage as the way to gender equality. This author contends that the ways of resistance are as varied as the methods of oppression in different socio-cultural contexts. Without female rage and activism, the rise of the Bengali woman author would be an impossible reality due to the double burden of the colonized patriarchy. Such an intersectional perception of the history of the rise of the creative women becomes immensely relevant in current contexts where white feminism continues to exclude the histories, issues, and concerns of women from post-colonial countries. Thank you. That's all.
Oh, thank you. So I'd like to thank all our presenters. So I'd start by observing that was a strongly unitized panel thematically, in that gender, labor, and issues of borders and other spaces crossed all the papers. I'd first invite the speakers to if they have comments or thoughts, suggestions on each other's work, if they would like to use the time now to share.
I had a question for Tatyana, if I may.
Go ahead.
Yes.
I found it very interesting that you talked about how windows acted as a heterotopic space where contesting factors could be brought together within the same ambit in Woolf's work. Now, while Woolf was writing, we also know that the new, because somebody else also talked about new woman, and the new woman in practice, or the new woman in magazine, has often been pitted against the new woman in literature, or so to say, the new woman that has conceptually been perceived over the years. Insofar as that the new woman in practice was actually supposed to be a supporter, in a way, in an indirect way, of the already existing patriarchal system, given that they were working outside in the polis, but only having roles which would keep them indoors. While on the other hand, the new woman in magazine was supposed to be a degenerate person who was a threat to the society. Now, while we're talking about windows in Woolf's Oval and viewing these windows as places where conflicting impressions, conflicting ideas can be brought together, may we also view these windows as an entry point into complicating the oikos-polis divide that we had in the concept of the new woman, such that these new women were already working outside, but just that the clear distinction which we have had so far in between the oikos and the polis got further complicated because the women who were working outside were also provided with roles which limited their space to indoors. So how does Woolf, or could we rather, use Woolf's use of windows as an entry point into this matter?
I think this is an excellent idea and an excellent suggestion. I think I'm arriving at this point by looking more at it through the shop windows, because this is just the kind of discovery, let's say, that I have made, that I can also talk about that. And I think a shop window can be a really good example of what you have just described. And also, well, the Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street comes to mind, because there are a lot of good juxtapositions there between the new woman and, you know, what is supposed to be propriety and kind of old style and what's supposed to be proper. You know, women, young girls returning from the party at 4 o'clock alone in the car with kind of bright makeup on again, which is something that's coming into fashion and becoming more and more visible outside in the city. And also, you know, the whole idea of plate windows becoming these places where you can just be and look at things and imagine other versions of yourself. So I think, you know, this is now, I did not initially plan on really going into this direction, but now I think that this could be like an interesting aspect that I would like to certainly include. I think I was maybe kind of limiting myself to the windows in houses and such, but I have realized that, you know, I have to think much more broadly. So yes, thank you for that. That's
Also, Tatyana, one of the moments in which windows figure very prominently is in a room of one's own. Like her vision of androgyny is when she looks out of this window and she sees a man and a woman taking public transport. And so,
well, in all of the novels, windows are just so central, and that's why I am also kind of sticking to the short stories, because in the novels there are so many good images there. Absolutely, and your example is also very good. Also in Orlando, there is this very good image.
Looking out of the window from time to time to see what is.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, thank you.
Amrita, you had a question for Meghna?
I have a comment. Meghna, I think your Subornolota is located a lot of Subornolota takes place in the early 20th century, and Subornolota's middle age definitely maps this transition from Hindu revivalism, Hindu nationalism to the Gandhian era. To the Gandhian era, and Bokulkotha is clearly taking place in post-independent India. So you might want to be a bit careful about that. The other thing is that don't you feel it is a reductive reading of Ashapurna to see her as this sort of artist of the private sphere? Because especially if you look at if you read the trilogy, like not just Subornolota and Bokulkotha, but also the first part, but this is not very pertinent to Woolf, but I think it also is pertinent to Woolf in the sense that Ashapurna is located in, I think both Woolf and Ashapurna are very much invested in domesticity, in the domestic world. Whereas you might find it easier to work with I think after a point, the public-private binary becomes a bit restrictive, because it doesn't really capture either it doesn't really capture the entirety of feminine experience, either in an Occidental or in a colonial colonial urban experience, which is what Subornolota and Bokulkotha and much of Woolf's work is about. So that was my comment.
I would like to respond to this about the problem with the time period. You said that a lot of Subornolota's life stretches into the 20th century, but Subornolota's journey begins in the late 19th century, and even Mrs. Ramsay, the entire To the Lighthouse, the narrative takes place in the first decade of the 20th century. But even Mrs. Ramsay comes from the late 19th century and its values. You have to see the context where people were born, and also the class structure into which they were born, because even like in the late 19th century, maybe there were many upcoming women authors, but mostly restricted to the elite classes and not to the middle classes. Subornolota belonged from the middle class, and she was born in the later half of the 19th century, and yes, she lived out most of her life in the 20th century.
But as we know that the Indian middle class does not can we really make these neat parallel
answer? Then you can proceed. About Bokul is also Bokul's the entire trajectory of Bokulkotha is a lot of it is in post-independent India, but Bokul also appears in Subornolota, if like we can see that. So Bokul's journey does not start in Bokulkotha, it starts in Subornolota. So if you have to take up a process of evolution, you have to start where the character appears first. So of course you have to take up the idea that she was functioning in she also existed in the beginning decades before the independence period. So that is, I think, how I would like to address this question. And the next, I forgot what you asked me next. So if you would like to repeat that.
What I'm trying to say is that that it doesn't really, I don't think literary criticism would really work if we just like took texts and mapped them onto each other, right? Ashapurna is writing until like, obviously, if we are working in a paradigm in which, like, if you just take the two texts side by side and place them beside each other, then yes, obviously it looks like Mrs. Ramsay does less work, and Mrs. Ramsay's work is lighter, and Subornolota has a much harsher life. But but my point is that a reading like this, like, where do you go from this reading? Because
what is the problem with considering that Mrs. Ramsay does less work than Subornolota? I am not trying to prove Mrs. Ramsay's trauma or oppression is any less than Virginia, than Suborno's problems. Everybody's problems or issues are valid in their particular cultural contexts. So what I was trying to show is not equate them exactly, but show that they are different and why they are different. That was the point. It's not really equating or comparing exactly, it's understanding how distinct the process is and why is it distinct. Actually, when I had first conceived this work, the question you asked me now, that question I asked myself back then. And the problem is that we can't really equate two cultures or like two very different socio-cultural contexts unless we are asking the question why they are different. Like that could be a point of view from where we could criticize two texts when it comes to comparative literature.
Mm-hmm. Right. It seems to be the whole question of and sort of an ethical question of comparative literature itself, what its utility is and what its limits are. We've got just a couple more minutes left before we have to cede the room to another panel entitled 20th Century Psychospaces. I invite people to stay. Any last thoughts, comments? I don't want to, shut it down, but I have to keep track of the time. Tatyana, I had one last question for you, and that is, the other hat that I wear is I'm an early modern English literature specialist, and so a lot is written about in Renaissance, English Renaissance or early modern drama, about window scenes. I mean, most famously, people like Shakespeareans like to point out that the balcony scene is actually a window scene. So, and I'm just wondering the degree to which this discussion of windows for you has a genealogy that goes back to stage drama, because the window, is the most right. You can get away with it on a stage imaginatively, so that as we stop allowing dramatists to have, let's say, sea battles on stage, we could still do a window scene and people would accept the window scene, within the proscenium arch. So I was just wondering about your thoughts about the past of your window concept.
I think I like the idea of the theater really a lot because it brings out the, another aspect of heterotopia here. Spaces within spaces in the theater and how it's constructed. So I really like that. But as to how to place window within this context, I don't have anything to say about this right now in terms of like the background. But I would like to look into the theater kind of idea of imaginary windows, or how you stage that, because when I deal with like literary urbanism and urban life, and a lot of urban scenes are also kind of staged and performed. So maybe that could be a connection that I can make potentially. But yeah, that's a very interesting idea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good luck with it. Any last thoughts, comments?
So I just wanted a clarification from Amrita. She asked something relating to Ashapurna Devi as a private artist, some question along that lines that I think I did not address. So would she like to repeat that question?
I said, are you sure that it makes sense to locate Subornolota in the private realm? Because because in a sense, the text is very, if you look at both Pratham Pratisruti, look at all three of them, it's about Subornolota's life is characterized by this feeling of confinement, which is but is it fair to say that is it fair to talk about it as, because then we end up perpetuating this image of the South Asian woman writer as it were the writer of a state of perfect victimhood, right? As these people who live in a permanent state of confinement, which ultimately I would say creates a simplistic paradigm.
About Chakraborti in Pratham Pratisruti, yeah, she is, I did not, of course, refer to her here, but Chakraborti is an exception, a radical. You wouldn't find women like Chakraborti in the 19th century, really. She's like one of those exceptions. And it is because if the entire trajectory had been very linear, then you would see that Chakraborti doing like breaking out into the public sphere, and then Subornolota also taking that and progressing. But this does not happen because Subornolota's life goes into a state of confinement, as you yourself mentioned. I did not really, why I talked about Subornolota as a woman artist who remains in the private sphere. It is true that there are certain public aspects of her artistic efforts, like she does try to publish a memoir, but the thing is it doesn't really succeed. And by taking up the idea of
Meghna, I'm going to have to ask you to bring it to a final sentence, and we're going to have to close down.
Okay, sir. So basically what I'm saying is that when I'm saying that in the establishment of a creative identity in the public sphere, I really mean that achieving a subjective vision and also living independent lives owing to your creative identity, which Subornolota can never do, but Lily Briscoe does, and Bokulkotha also does. So that is what I mean, that independence that comes with having a creative identity in the public sphere.
Great.